Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest installment of the U.S. Biosphere Network's Biosphere Bites bi-weekly seminar series. My name is Katie Darr. I chair the U.S. Biosphere Network's Communications Committee, and I coordinate the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. Some housekeeping before we get started. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're asking or answering a question during the Q&A, and we will monitor the chat throughout and put your questions in there as they arise, and we can get to them during that Q&A period. As you can see, these meetings are recorded and will be posted on the U.S. Biosphere Network's YouTube channel after for folks who can't attend live or want to view it again later. And while I'm introducing our speakers, I would welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat and share what Biosphere region you're tuning in from, if that applies to you today. And we are so lucky to have Tom Gilbert and Sarah Gaines with us. Given the few minutes we have for these introductions, I will say we'll barely scratch the surface on their great careers, accomplishments, and contributions to conservation and biosphere regions. So I want to thank them up top for all of their hard work. Tom Gilbert is a lifelong conservationist, facilitator, and thought leader in the field of ecology. He was pivotal from the earliest stages in planning and promoting UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, including the establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park as one of the first international biosphere reserves in 1976. He's also a founder of the Southern Appalachian Man and Biosphere Cooperative, and in his long career, he has served in many positions with the National Park Service, including leading the U.S. delegation to the Third World Congress on Biosphere Reserves. His contributions and achievements in natural areas conservation are long and significant, and he worked for many years in Africa, India, and Central America, where he planned natural area reserves and parks. And most recently, he has led the SAMAB collaboration for the conservation of culturally significant plants with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. Sarah Gaines is a coastal research associate specializing in climate resilience, conservation, and sustainable development at the Coastal Resources Center of the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. In her previous role at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, she worked with the Man in the Biosphere Secretariat, developed UNESCO's Earth Science Education Initiative in Africa, and contributed to the establishment of UNESCO geoparks. Through her work balancing conservation and sustainable livelihood demands around the world, Sarah has focused on natural and cultural heritage conservation, spatial planning, and the science policy interface. She previously served as the vice chair of the U.S. Biosphere Network, and Sarah and Tom first met in Madrid in 2008 during the Third World Congress of Biosphere Reserves. Without further ado, I welcome Sarah and Tom, and please share your talk.
Katie, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for hosting us today. I'd like to, especially recognize Chris Groves for the inspiration behind doing this presentation. Initially, the idea was just to do a Biosphere Bite presentation, and then, following some conversations between myself and Tom, we agreed it would be most effective if I went down to visit him in Tennessee in the Smokies, and we did this in a slightly different way, and so. I hope you'll be flexible with us. We are presenting a film of our conversations. It's a little bit of a travelogue and an open discussion between myself and Tom that took place in the Smokies. I guess it was almost a month ago now. So we don't have a lot of time. I would propose we just get started. Tom, did you want to say a few words before we start the film?
Yes, thanks very much. I'm just so pleased that Ernesto and Jim can join us because there's the ecosystems, the species, all of the things that we share with Canada and Mexico, and the relationship under the Man and Biosphere program with Canada and Mexico has been very good over the years, and I hope it will be strengthened more and more in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining today. So I'll go ahead and start the film, and then we'll be ready for questions and answers when it's over. Thanks.
Hey there, Sarah Gaines here with Tom Gilbert in Clingman's Dome at Great Smoky National Park, also a Biosphere Reserve. I came down with my son over his spring break to visit Tom and see peak wildflower season. All right, we have a couple questions for Tom.
Okay.
So
let me
Tom, here
just-
we are in the Smokies.
Sorry, let me fix this.
Could you tell us a little bit about how this region became a Biosphere Reserve and how it fits into, the larger plan for Biosphere Reserves as a tool to build peace and common understanding?
Sarah, thank you. I'd be glad to. And I'm so glad that you and your son Henry could come down and visit the Smokies. I wish you had more time because it's such an interesting and large national park. But I started to work here back in 1974 as a ranger naturalist and worked here for several years until I got a permanent job. But I learned back when I was working as a ranger naturalist how important it was for the national park to work with the surrounding communities and with other agencies. Bordering this national park is national forests, and also Tennessee Valley Authority built dams, and there's a lake just down this valley over here, Fontana Lake. You won't be able to see it because it's a rather hazy day. We're up at an elevation, Sarah and Henry just walked up to the tower, 6,643 feet. We're down at the parking area below, but it's up in the spruce fir forest. But the Smokies was an example that I used of what a biosphere reserve might be when I went to Paris in 1973 to help plan what began as a UNESCO project called Conservation of Natural Areas and of the Genetic Material they contain. But the idea even then was that this would become an international network. And they changed the name to Biosphere Reserves back in 1974. And then we and the United States hosted a conference, the third conference for the International MAB International Coordinating Committee in Washington, and we had a big conference where the delegates from a number of nations enthusiastically joined the program and said what kind of areas they would designate as biosphere reserves. So this was in the fall of 1974. And then by 1976, the biosphere reserves that were recommended were established, and the United States took the lead, first with 20 areas that became designated biosphere reserves. And Sarah and Henry and I just came up from a place called Newfound Gap, where we looked at the plaque for Biosphere Reserves, the international network, and also World Heritage. And a lot of the Biosphere Reserves are also designated World Heritage sites. But anyway, that's kind of an introduction. I'll tell you more later about how I got to Paris and why. But I wanted you to know that this area was recommended or was used as what a biosphere reserve might be of a national park, working with neighboring communities and other agencies in the region to have more of a kind of regional or landscape approach to conservation.
Great, thank you. Oh, you've been sharing stories today about all the different international experts and dignitaries who've passed through the Great Smokies through the years with you as their guide, and maybe you could just share some highlights with the network about some of the international folks who've come here to visit the Smokies, and also a little bit about why they came and what they saw as the takeaway that they made from the visit here.
Oh, I'd be glad to. I just hit some highlights because of the really important high-level people who have been here, and I'll start with. This is not a biosphere reserve, but the vice president of the little country of the Gambia. We were planning a national park there, and I got him here. His name was Bakary Dabo, and he came and we took him on tours, and so he saw how a national park works closely with surrounding communities, gateway communities, with campgrounds and places to stay, and even helping out before they enter the park to know something about the national park. So Bakary Darbo was here from the Gambia. Dr. Jamaluddin from Indonesia headed the Ministry of Forestry, big ministry. Forestry is so important in Indonesia. And Dr. Jamaluddin also administered the national parks. And he had asked me at a conference in Indonesia, in Jakarta, if could do more for the communities in outside the national parks and biosphere reserves in Indonesia. And I said, yes, there's a good program. I call it the Gateway Communities Program. And so we started that program and got Jamaluddin and some of his colleagues over here to look at what we were doing in the Southern Appalachians. Unfortunately, so many of these programs end because of wars or conflicts. The president in Suharto was overthrown, and so that program, institutional strengthening in Indonesia, came to an end. Many I've had people, high-level people from countries in Africa here, from the Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, important people from India, several of them, including the Dr. Ramanathan, who headed the Indian an environmental program. And oh gosh,
I think we talked about China, right? We talked about some similarities with Chinese systems.
There were Chinese and Japanese who have been here, and a good many times. In fact, my professor at the University of Tennessee trained a number of Japanese students who became authorities, particularly on bryophytes, mosses, and the like. And Dr. Sharp got the Order of the Rising Sun Award because of the training of the Japanese botanists. And so, where else? Oh, of course, there were from the Soviet Union people who came here, even in the exchange program that we had back years ago, because we've got in the Smokies these European wild hogs or boars that were introduced years ago for hunting purposes in a place miles away from here, but now they've spread. So we, since the European wild boar, the Russians knew a great deal about handling it. We've had them over here in the past for advising about how to control the European boar.
I was very surprised to see that boar in the visitor center this morning.
What were you so surprised?
That this European boar is a member of the, the community of the here in the Smokies.
Yeah, they really tear up the landscape.
I think we also were talking about some similarities in the biodiversity, or at least the botany of the Smokies with China. I was just reading in this field guide that the Smokies have some of the most botanical biodiversity in the Northern Hemisphere, thanks in part to many influences, including not being glaciated.
Yeah, there are lots of species, floral similarities between the Great Smoky Mountain region and China and Japan, Asia generally. So this reminds me, Sarah, that about China. When I was in charge of the environmental education program for the Park Service, a friend told me that Chairman Mao Zedong had wanted to go see the Grand Canyon when he was a young man. And so we talked to the director of the Park Service then, George Hartzog, and said, "Did you know this?" "Oh, no, never heard of it." So we had a meeting, and the director, Hartzog, got on the phone to the White House, and I got on the phone to Harper's Ferry to the photographers, and we put together a portfolio of big, colorful pictures, not only Grand Canyon, but other national parks, with the idea that Chinese officials would be invited to come. But what happened at the same time, and Ron Walker was Nixon's advance man. Ron became the director of the Park Service after his visit to China. But Ron told me that, and his wife had written a book about, called China Calls, that the Forest Service had sent seedlings of redwoods and sequoia to China with the idea that they would be planted in different places in China, and as they grew, friendship between our countries would grow. Well, those have grown, and they must be pretty big trees now in China. And I'm hoping that we can find out just how big and where they grow, and maybe before that China is going to host the 5th, I believe, Biosphere Congress in 2025. And maybe we can get together with the Chinese on the Biosphere Reserve program, and that would be a way of helping to reduce conflicts and renewing friendships. Because those sequoias and redwoods must be pretty good sized.
What year were they planted now?
When was Nixon's visit to China? Let's see. This was when I came back from Africa, was in 1971, and I think that I forget now when Nixon, but it was around 1972, 73 that they sent an advance party to China, and then Nixon went to China. Oh, I should remember, something like.
Okay, so we're looking for some 50-year-old sequoia and redwoods.
Yeah.
If anyone in the network is collaborators in China or is going there anytime soon, please keep your eyes open for 50-year-old redwoods and sequoias. We need to track them down. We'd like to have a 50-plus year reunion and figure out what's happened to them.
And Dr. Ishwaran, who Sarah and I had both worked closely with, he has good relationships with China, and he's going to help us find out this information.
Great. Thanks. So Tom and I have been talking about the, some of the first meetings. There was an International Coordinating Council held in Washington, D.C. in 1974 to propose the initial Biosphere Reserves, which started out, as I understand, a partnership between U.S. and Russia. So I think it's interesting. At that time, it would have been USSR, right, in 74. Right. Thinking about the situation in world politics right now, and for many people who are part of the or the U.S. network might not really be fully aware of what the political situation was between the U.S. and Russia in 74. But I think it's useful to reflect a little bit on, the idea of it's not just science diplomacy, it's conservation diplomacy, and the idea of using these representative sites as peace-building sites. So if you could talk a little bit about that partnership with Nixon and Brezhnev and the meetings that took place that really kicked off the World Network.
Sure.
And also, actually, I think it's important for everyone to know that the MAB program existed before Biosphere Reserves. There were a series of different scientific agendas, and establishing biosphere reserves came later. It wasn't initially part of the MAP program, and it was only one of a series of different agendas. So I think many of us consider biosphere reserves and the MAP program to be synonymous, but
Yeah.
they weren't. It wasn't always that
No.
way. So please go ahead.
Actually, when I went to Paris in 1973, there were 14 MAB project areas to deal with tropical forest and temperate forests and mountains, even a project on perception of the environment. But the Biosphere Reserve project was the one that I went to Paris for, and it began with a project called Conservation of Natural Areas and the Genetic Material It Contained. But I had heard that President Nixon was going to go to Moscow in 1974, in July of 1974, and there was a program that had been started between the United States and the Soviet Union on environmental protection. And I worked with that program for a while, so I proposed that our two countries should support the MAB program and especially established Biosphere Reserves. So the meeting in Washington after that summit conference in August of the summit conference, and the announcement was in July of 1974. The International Coordinating Council meeting in Washington was in August that year, 1974, and that's when a number of countries pledged. It was very enthusiastic support when a number of countries announced that they would nominate Biosphere Reserve areas. The United States was the first to nominate or name specific areas, and there were about 20 of them. And then Vladimir Sokolov from the Soviet Union announced that they would nominate areas and mention some examples. Canadians did. I don't remember which countries, but it was really very, very good program that helped to kick off the Biosphere Reserve program. And then from that, the criteria and the guidelines for the reserves were reviewed, and then in 1976 it was when the first Biosphere Reserves in the area were officially established by UNESCO. And Sarah and I were standing at the plaque up at Newfound Gap in the Smokies earlier today, and that plaque was that from 1976, but a little later on they had dedication ceremonies in a number of the Biosphere Reserve areas, and so in many of them there are these bronze plaques that say that this area is an international Biosphere Reserve. That's a quick summary of
Sure,
that.
great, thank you. And what was the role of peace and peace building? Was there an explicit agreement with the establishment of these?
The role
of building peace through Biosphere Reserves, or building understanding between countries?
Well, back in 1945, UNESCO was chartered, was officially established, and it was primarily to work for peace. And, this is after the World War, and the United Nations program was established, but UNESCO was established as a specialized organization of the UN to work toward peace through education, science, and cultural activities. That was the charter and the preamble to the UNESCO charter.
If I can add, that mandate was very motivating to me personally, and I can paraphrase it, that wars begin in the hearts and minds of men and women, and through those same hearts and minds, peace must be built. Yes. So the idea is about shared understanding, be it in culture, science, education, etc., is how you build peace.
War begins. Archibald MacLeish wrote that preamble, and that if wars begin in the minds of men and women, then it has to be in the minds of men and women that we are going to solve these problems and work toward peace. And UNESCO has an important program now. It's called the UNESCO section on global citizenship and peace education. And we're surely hoping that that program can be actively involved in the world network of biosphere reserves, so that there's a lot of information that we should know about the different conflicts in the world, endangered earth, that can be applied if more people, more institutions and communities are interested in joining in efforts to resolve these conflicts, or even before they happen. So UNESCO has a pretty good record, particularly it's been going for a number of years, particularly in post-conflict situations, and working with government and communities to bring them back together and to more secure economies. I should mention also that UNESCO a few years ago joined forces with the Asia Society, which also has a very good global citizenship program. And so that's what we're hoping for, aiming for, even to urge that these two programs work closely together during this upcoming Euromab conference, which will take place in June in Germany. It just makes sense, because we're not going to be able to conserve. The theme at the beginning of the Biosphere program was keeping options open, doing to the best of our ability, securing genetic resources, etc., that we depend upon for our livelihood. Can't do that very well as long as there are so many conflicts and human suffering in the world. So these two programs together, there's some hope that it can have some really positive effect.
So just so everyone caught that, there's the program of the Biosphere Reserves, and then there's a program in the education sector at UNESCO on global citizenship and educating people for global citizenship. So what we're proposing is that we should really push to bring these two programs together and think about global citizenship as kind of a core skill also of people who work in conservation, and to be thinking about the connections between conservation and citizenship, certainly as we think about the connections between these different places around the world, and how we practiced, dare I say, sustainable development in these places. So we would be really interested in building, a working group within the U.S. Biosphere Region network to think about how we could bring together some of these educational programs with the Biosphere Region model. Go ahead.
And I may make one more point. Often when something like this is proposed, the question is, where's the money going to come from? Well, it wouldn't take much money at all, because of the existing information and the resources that exist in these programs, both UNESCO and the Asia Society, that could be easily incorporated into education programs at nature centers, here in the Smokies, the Great Smoky Mountains Institute at Tremont, even into university and college curricula. There's enough information that can be incorporated into existing programs that it wouldn't cost anything except some effort to investigate what information is already there and resources that we can use.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Tom. And thanks for piloting that new format for us. I thought that worked really well. So recognizing we are at 12:30, if folks have to hop off, feel free to do so, but also recognizing that we have some time with Tom and Sarah, want to leave some time for Q&A for those who are able to stick on a little longer. I'll just start by saying I really appreciate you both doing this. I learned so much, and I think this is good. I'm glad we've recorded this also. I think this should be a required watch for all Biosphere Region professionals. I learned so much about the history of the program, and I think my favorite story within there was learning about the redwoods growing as a symbol of friendship in China, between the US and China. So thank you. If folks have questions, I'll stop talking and open the floor for that or other comments.
Well, I'll start just because I can't wait. Tom, thank you so much about both of you. That just, I'm speechless and just sort of how pumped I am. You mentioned about the vice president of the Gambia coming through the Smokies, and we had talked about the Gambia not too long ago, that when you had to leave work and then pick up Patsy on the way to the airport to escape a military coup in the Gambia, when he came to the Smokies, was that before or after that?
that was before that. Yes, Patsy and I were at the project house in the Gambia and coming back from the Kiang West National Park, and there were these great big spikes in the road and soldiers with rifles, and so they wanted to confiscate the vehicle. It was a USAID vehicle, and I persuaded them to let us go. They held the driver's license so that he would come back, and I rushed to the house and said, Patsy, we got to get out of here. I called the embassy and said what was happening. They already knew, but we, yeah, that was the beginning of the coup in the Gambia. And the U.S. sent a carrier in to rescue Bakary Dabo and his family, and he went into exile in England. But let me say, just get over that quickly. I was really pleased with the work that you, Chris, and all of you on this team to develop the U.S. Biosphere Region Charter. It's very good, and I really appreciate the work that you all have done. And I think that sets the stage for this kind of cooperation, particularly with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, to begin with.
Ernesto?
Hi, buenos días. We always talk about biosphere reserves as learning sites. Do you have any thoughts of how we can make that learning become mainstream? Because I see that we're always learning, and we need to break and start to provide some of that learning for the broader mainstream decision making. So I know it's a huge question, but your thoughts would be much appreciated.
Well, thanks, Ernesto, for that question. Yes, when I got back from Africa, for a while I led the National Park Service environmental education program. And I always looked at how we could achieve multiplier effects, especially by working with teachers, our scientists and resource management working with teachers. And we did that on a national basis, the National Environmental Study Area Program and the National Environmental Education Development Program, which really achieved a tremendous multiplier effect. And I presented a paper at the Second World Conference on National Park about this, called it an expanding horizon, the role of reserves and parks in education. Just think, if we can work closely with the education sector in UNESCO and work closely in all of these biosphere reserves, in the many programs and institutions that we have associated with them, but particularly to work with educational systems and teachers, how much of a multiplier effect that would be. That's basically the idea, I think.
Thank
James?
you very much.
I hope I'm loud enough. I haven't traveled the world the way Tom has, but I want to say testimony to the benefits of belonging to a network such as this worldwide. I went to Spain. I had a wonderful, and Ireland, and was shown around biosphere reserves and treated like a special guest. Did the same thing in Brazil. I'm still processing ideas I got from there. And I remember being at the Third World Congress, which is where I met Tom. And in the meeting, there was a fellow from Israel and a woman from Iran. And they were talking about how they were going to try and protect a certain type of sheep or goats that lived in both countries. And they wanted to somehow bring them together to increase the diversity of the flocks. And I remember one of them saying, "This is the only way that you and I could talk at a conference like this." So that's always impressed me. That's all.
Jim, I couldn't hear.
He said he talked of an Israeli and.
Thanks for sharing that story, Jim. In fact, Tom had shared some details of that interaction when we were on the trip as well. So, you know, common grounds, I think it's so incredibly important for building peace, and the role of individuals, right? I think that's another element of this, Ernesto. The angle of education is also for individuals, right? Committed to education, committed to learning, and the way we view the world, the way we interact with each other in these places.
May I add something? I couldn't hear all of that, but I wanted to call attention to Jim Birch's beautiful little book on sustainability of communities. And I think you all should know about it. And I think, Jim, you're going to illustrate it and make it available in sometime in the near future.
It's now an ebook, and you can get it from Amazon as a Kindle version, or you can go to the publisher and order it directly. But be sure to tell them that you want a protected PDF, or they're going to charge you a horrendous distribution charge. Otherwise, it's just the cost of the book, the ebook, which is $15. And the paperback is really expensive, and only really good friends such as Tom and my nephew have bought it, I think. Thank you, Tom. Tom, I was just saying the benefits of belonging to this network. When you and I were in the Third World Congress, I was at a meeting where an Israeli fellow and an Iranian woman were talking about sheep or goats that were in both their countries, and they wanted to be able to get them together for obvious reasons. And one of them said, "This is the only way that you and I could talk." So I thought that was quite nice and related to peace building too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Hi, Tom, and hi, Sarah. Thank you very
Hi, Tom.
much for putting this together. It's been a great opportunity to be reminded of what the Biosphere Reserve program is all about. My question is, getting back to education, how do we get the academic community more engaged with Biosphere Reserves?
It's a good question. I can take a first stab at it. I guess part of that relates to funding, right? Because so much of the academic work is driven by funding for research. So, you know, I think if we as members of the Biosphere Region Network, if we make sure that these regions are relevant for research and that we have these connections and that we're ready to collaborate, recognizing that that is a motivation for many academics. So I guess for me, it also comes back to partnerships, relationships, thinking about some of the key issues of our time, like biodiversity loss and climate change and human encroachment, needs for development. But ultimately to be ready to collaborate so that people can get funding to further their research. Tom, perhaps you have some more thoughts on that.
And may I add that one way there are so many of universities and colleges associated with biosphere reserves, and I've been very lucky that I've gotten to know Gary McCracken, and that's been a number of years. Without him, I would have not been able to do nearly so much with the University of Tennessee, and that's going very well. We are beginning to incorporate a citizenship education program in the curricula at the University of Tennessee, and particularly work with Japan, the good exchange program that we've got with Japan. Japan has 10 biosphere reserves and actively involved in the global citizenship. So just getting to know the people at the universities and colleges is one way.
Yeah, I don't know how to do the little hand on this version of it, so if I can just speak up. I would just like to point like sort of a theme that's come through today, and that is that Sarah's right. In academia, funding, for research, I mean, we're kind of in this business of scholars to generate new information. But Tom made a point before that there's already a great deal of information that already exists that's in people's heads, or that's not necessarily being shared. There's just not mechanisms for it. So that there is a certain amount of community building and sharing of information that doesn't really cost that much. That we just have to figure out how to communicate between the people. And one thing, it doesn't have to be the U.S. and China and Soviet Union. There's 12 of us right here, and that are doing that exact thing. And so I think one thing is that it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be really big. You sort of do things a little as you're able. So.
Related to that, Chris, the George Wright Society has a lot of historical information that has been accumulated by the National Park Service and other entities over the years. John Dennis helped collect it, and Bill Gregg, and it's available online right now. You just go on to the George Wright website into the information section, publications.
Great. Yeah, in fact, John Dennis, you sent a link yesterday. I was turning in my last grades. Is that the same resource that he's talking about?
No. What I sent yesterday was the Park Service site that I didn't realize existed. The George Wright site has been worked on, over the last 10 years or more, Dave?
Yeah.
So the George Wright site's a good place for some of the older documents.
Related to that, maybe actually we should have a link to the George Wright Society. I did ask Katie, we had a couple articles we wanted to share related to this webinar. We didn't have a chance to get into the whole story of Sovereignty International and, this issue of politicization of private property. And I feel like it's very relevant for the world today. And so we wanted to just publish some of those articles that Tom has written, and I know some are on the George Wright Society. It's useful to read those again and think about how do we work with people who politically seem very different. And I think it's important that we reflect on it. That could be a whole nother webinar. It's actually it needs to be a discussion, I think. But check out those articles.
Well, Tom certainly can contribute to that discussion on how do we work with people who have different views.
May I add that, and thanks to Dave for, I believe the George Wright Society has an agreement with the Department of Interior to help put on these conferences. And I've suggested both Chris and people at the University of Tennessee. University of Tennessee, for example, is a member of the Southern Appalachian Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit, and is Western Kentucky University. This is another way, a multiplier effect, if we use this CESU program in the U.S. to spread the word. And the George Wright Society does a really good job on these conferences.
Oh, one other thing I can't help but add, and I'll make a comment sort of on Sarah here and then circle back in a second. And that is, part of this is that, somehow, us coming together, there's sort of just a great deep bench of experiences and skills. That's pretty obvious. I just want to highlight two of Sarah's, one that I knew about, one that I didn't until today. And that is that just the thing that Sarah apparently knows how to do, that few people in the world know how to do, but it's very, very convenient under the circumstances. And that is remove botfly larvae from under people's skin out in the jungle with a Swiss Army knife. So kudos to her for that. I also didn't know that you had picked up cinematography. That was just beautiful today. Did you learn that on the fly, or is that just another one of your past lives? So.
Thanks. I can give a little lesson on Adobe Rush if anyone wants to learn how to make films with their cell phones. It's something that I learned doing this project. It's always nice to be challenged to do new things.
All right. Any final closing thoughts or wisdom folks want to share?
We need to get Tom and Sarah together again to do a follow-up on some additional topics.
Chris is talking about doing something in Mammoth, so we'll see if we can manage something in Mammoth in the fall.
Great.
Yep.
I do feel like so much of this is a conversation that needs to have a lot of people. So I hope the format was okay for you, because I was trying to invite everybody into a conversation, little different from a PowerPoint slide. But Evan, I wanted to just give a shout out. Evan Carter's on this call, and I feel like there's a whole nother history of the evolution of the SA MAB and the SA Biosphere Cooperative that needs to be told that we didn't fit into this session. So we were kind of telling a historical perspective on the Smokies, but there's a lot of things that have happened more recently.
I really like the video. I like the video format. Very nice. Well done.
You're all welcome to come here to the Great Smoky Mountains, and we can have a meeting at my house in Pittman Center.
Yeah, in fact, I'll point out the view, if I have it right, that Sarah had of Tom sitting in the chair for a lot of the interview. If you turn the camera 90 degrees that way, is one of the most beautiful views of the Smoky Mountains through the woods there. So yeah, I recommend a visit down there. So fantastic. Thank you, Tom.
All right. I feel bad cutting this off. It's such a great conversation with you all. But thanks for joining this Biosphere Bites, and Tom and Sarah, thank you for all of the wealth of knowledge you shared today, and looking forward to diving into those resources that have been shared in the chat and learning even more, and maybe a part 2 to this discussion at some point. So thanks everyone. I hope you have a great day, and stay tuned for the recording.
Thank you.
Thanks all.